This is KSL Sunday Edition with Boyd Matheson.
Welcome to Sunday Edition. I am Boyd Matheson. Each Sunday, we attempt to divide the rage from the reason, elevate the conversation, connect the dots, and make the news make sense. We have conversations with great thinkers, great leaders, and great people making a difference. We talk politics so we can discuss society, and we explore society so we can discuss principles and the people in America who live them. We bring the best and brightest to Utah, and we send the Utah model to our nation's capital and beyond. Well, according to Brad Wilcox, America is in crisis. Happiness is falling, loneliness and despair are rising, too many schools are riddled by fights and failure, crime is unacceptably high, and the American dream is out of reach for millions. The problems are visible to all of us, but virtually no one is talking about the solution that matters most: marriage. Brad Wilcox is a professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, the Future of Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He studies marital quality, marital stability, and the impact of strong and stable marriages upon men, women, and importantly, on children. He's the author of numerous books and does extraordinary research on marriage and family life. His new book, Get Married: Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. It's set to release just in time for Valentine's Day. Well, Brad, welcome back to Sunday Edition. We have a lot of ground to cover, and looking forward to the new book coming out. We've had a chance to sneak into that just a little bit. As you look at it, a lot of Americans think that the path to happiness is either through money, through work, or through personal freedom. You say not so fast.
Yeah, there's a kind of Midas mindset out there, Boyd, where a lot of Americans are convinced that, that money, that work, that kind of building their own brand is going to, bring them a sense of fulfillment, happiness, meaning, direction in their lives. But what they don't recognize, they don't realize, they don't appreciate is that actually our relationships, we're social animals, as Aristotle said, and so our friendships and our family relationships especially matter, and nothing really matters more for most Americans than the quality of their marriage.
Yeah, and so talk us through that a little bit in terms of what does that real happiness really include as we look at it?
So what we see in general on that score is that, for instance, married Americans are about twice as likely to be happy as unmarried Americans. What we see is that when we look at kind of data on, money, work, sex, religion, and marital quality, that marital quality is the top predictor of happiness, that couples who are in good marriages are 545% more likely to be happy with their lives in general, true for both basically men and women. So that's sort of the happiness story. But it's also important to note that really since COVID hit, since 2020, I've been coming across a lot of messaging in the mainstream media and also on social media platforms like TikTok, kind of suggesting to us that being a mother, being a father, being a married mom, being a married dad is kind of a recipe for misery, and there's certainly obviously people out there who've had difficult marriages, difficult family situations, but what that kind of messaging misses, Boyd, is that there is no group of Americans who are happier today than married moms and married dads. So for all the challenges and stresses that kids bring and that being a spouse brings, for the average American, kind of having the benefit of a spouse and the benefit of children and kind of the benefit of a full family life is a lot more important than a lot of the things that kind of can distract us in this culture.
Yeah, and there's so many distractions, and there's so many mixed messages, and messages that are either just flat wrong or really deceiving. And it's one of the things that I love digging into your book this week was the fact that you take on a lot of those myths, including the fact that a lot of people say, well, why get married? Half of them end up in divorce anyway. This is a path to misery.
Yes. So, Boyd, I was just actually speaking to a high school audience, and one young man, in the audience after I spoke, raised his hand and said, well, isn't it true? Or I've heard, that a lot of guys are divorced unwillingly. And he was and he acknowledged that he kind of heard Andrew Tate, this big guy in the manosphere online who kind of talks down marriage, is very popular among teenage boys. And one of his big kind of points is that, guys, don't be a fool, don't put a ring on it because you're just going to end up in divorce court. And a lot of Americans think that 1 in 2 marriages today end in divorce. But that's actually not true, Boyd. Most marriages today go the distance. We're seeing the divorce rate come down. It's come down 40% since 1980. And then we also see that some groups of Americans in particular are succeeding at marriage. I talk about, as you know, the masters of the marriage in the book, and they're especially likely to be doing well on the marriage front.
Yeah, so important. I want to get into those groups and what they're doing to actually thrive. But before we get to that, just before we take a break here, I want to get into the impact on our children. It's part of your research and part of your focus is, the adults are important. Marriages are absolutely critical. The impact this is having on children and future generations is way bigger than we thought.
Yeah. So what's, I think, kind of in some ways sobering is that we are seeing in terms of the polling data, there's a kind of a slight erosion of the share of Americans who think that marriage matters for kids. But what's, I think, striking is the paradox is that it looks like the data is telling us that marriage matters more than ever for our children. So we've done research in the Institute for Family Studies, for instance, showing that the link between kind of coming from a stably married family and graduating from college is stronger for millennials than it was for baby boomers. Other folks have done work looking at kind of high school attainment. There's other people who have been doing work on just sort of basically family economic stress who have found that sort of the benefits of marriage are larger today for our kids, economically, socially, and educationally. So the striking thing I think about this newer research is it suggests to us not just that marriage matters for kids, and I've been kind of making that point for a long time, as you know, but that marriage matters more for our kids than ever in a world that is more, I think, technologically distracted, in a world that's more economically unequal, in a world where people are not plugged into their local communities and religious communities as much as they were in a bygone era. It's in this context, this social, economic, and technological context, that having the benefit for kids of your mom and dad at home kind of with you and for you, I think is even more valuable today than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, no question about that. And we're going to do something we often do on this show. We often talk about the fact that Einstein said he wasn't smarter than anyone else. He was just willing to stay with the questions a little longer. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to stay with the conversation with Brad Wilcox as we discuss his soon-to-be released book, Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization, when Sunday Edition continues on KSL TV. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Brad Wilcox, professor of sociology and the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, and author of the new book coming out just in time for Valentine's this year, Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. And Brad, that's a really important part to me. There is a civilization component to this.
Right. Why
is that so profound?
I think a lot of Americans think about their marriage in terms of just their own personal relationship or maybe even their kids' welfare, but they don't necessarily appreciate how much what happens in their own home kind of spills out into their broader community, into the neighborhood, the city, the state, the country. And we know that actually Utah, for instance, has been ranked #1 when it comes to happiness, economic growth, and economic mobility for poor kids. That means kind of like a rags to riches story where kids are raised poor here in the Utah area and then go on to become successful financially as adults. And the reason I think that Utah does so well on these three indicators in part is that no other state matches Utah for the share of kids who are being raised in married parent families. And so what the data tell us is that for instance, there's no better predictor of mobility at the state and the community level than the share of two-parent families in a state. So that's kind of the civilizational point. And that is that what's happening in our families matters for the broader republic. It matters for the state, the community, the country. And so if we're concerned about kind of reviving the fortunes of the American civilization, including the pursuit of happiness, that was obviously the Jefferson's phrase in the Declaration, we need to think about ways to make our families stronger, our marriages stronger, because as I said, nothing is a better predictor of happiness for Americans than a good marriage. And we have seen from recent research at the University of Chicago that the biggest factor, the #1 factor that explains why we've seen a dip in happiness in this country is that fewer and fewer Americans are getting married.
Fascinating. I always love how you start with the data and then you get us to the application in society, the principles, so important. You've also looked, and this is a big part of the book that I love, you've looked at some groups that are really thriving in marriages. Who are those groups and what is it that they're doing?
So what I found in the research was that there are kind of 4 groups who are especially likely to be married today and to be happily married today, in most cases to be stably married. Those 4 groups are Asian Americans, they are religious Americans, they are college-educated Americans, and they are conservative Americans. And actually, the last group I had anticipated, including as a special group, but when you looked at kind of who was getting married and who was happily married, even controlling for religion, for instance, we still found that conservatives were especially likely to be married and to be happily married. So those 4 groups. I think what they have is really 2 things that's kind of going for them, Boyd. One is cash, and the other is culture in many cases. So on the cash point, they tend to enjoy a steady stream of income, especially from a reliable male breadwinner. You see that among a lot of these groups. And even today in 2024, we still find that couples are more likely to kind of move into marriage and to remain stably married when the guy is employed full-time. And that when women are mothers, they're more happily married when their husband is employed full-time. So I think that cash angle, men's employment, doing a decent job at work still, matters for the quality and stability of married life in the U.S. That's the cash point. The culture point, I think, is in part about 3 C's. One is a sense of communion in their marriage. The second C is a commitment in marriage. And the third C is community. And so the communion piece, kind of having that willingness to sort of cultivate a we before me mindset and to kind of keep that emotional connection alive with, for instance, regular date nights is certainly something that's strongly related to not just marital quality, marital stability, but also to sexual satisfaction. So that's, I think, worth mentioning. When it comes to commitment, kind of recognizing the importance of steering clear today of attractive alternatives to your spouse, both in the real world, but also in the virtual world, right? So kind of being careful on that score, and I think a lot of those groups are doing better when it comes to that kind of fidelity as a measure or expression of commitment. And then when it comes to community, what we see is that kind of birds of a feather flock together. And so if you're surrounded by people who don't take marriage and family life very seriously, who might make cutting comments about their spouse or your spouse or that kind of thing, you're much more likely to land in divorce court. By contrast, if you surround yourself with friends and family who are for you and with you in your marriage and who value marriage themselves and value their kids themselves, you're much more likely to succeed. And what we see in the research is that kind of the institution that's most likely to sort of conduce that kind of family-oriented mindset are religious institutions, churches, synagogues, mosques, temples here in the United States.
Yeah, fantastic. So important. And we often say that community and culture lead, politicians will follow. You actually carved this out as a segment of the book, that our politicians and political class have been failing marriage and American families.
Yeah, so I think there are a number of ways in which our political class has not paid enough attention to marriage and has not especially understood the ways in which kind of we're seeing a marriage divide in America rise up, where working class and poor Americans are more likely to struggle in their marriages today. And one reason that's the case, I think, is that our means-tested programs, things like Medicaid, that's publicly funded insurance, and what's called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is basically a program where the government supplements your paycheck. These things unintentionally penalize marriage for working class families, especially folks whose incomes run between, say, $25,000 and $55,000, who are together with kids. And so for that group, it's often more financially beneficial just to cohabit and have one parent apply for benefits, get benefits, and not get married. And that just sends, I think, a bad message to them, and it's a bad financial reality for them. And so I think, Congress actually has addressed some marriage penalties for upper income and middle income Americans, when it comes to income taxes, but they've not really tackled these means-tested program marriage penalties. And so I think that's a problem, and one thing that our political class could focus their attention on. And then one thing locally is I think Utah is considering adding what's called the success sequence to your public school curricula, which encourages the kids in public schools here in Utah to understand that high school degree, full-time work, and getting married before having kids, marriage before the baby carriage, that these steps, education, work, and marriage, are crucial to forging a good financial, pathway for yourself and for your family.
Yeah. As always, great thinking, great research, great insight. Brad Wilcox, thanks so much for joining us today. The book, Get Married, coming out just before Valentine's Day. Watch for that. So when we come back, we're going to talk about the power of ideas versus the idea of power and how our politics could actually reconcile the nation. Now, that might sound crazy in today's seemingly polarized world, but we're going to go within the parentheses of the crazy idea when we come back right here on KSL 5 TV. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sunday Edition. The purpose of our politics cannot and must not be based solely on the zero-sum idea of power. Rather, our politics, policy, and public discourse should be based on the power of ideas that are much greater than the idea of power. The idea of power, particularly power over others, has served as the piston firing the engine of 1,000 sorry tales of egocentric ambition, which often end in acrimony, abuse of office, and all kinds of atrocities. The pursuit of such power regularly ruins families, it corrupts communities, and devastates nations. Unchecked, the idea of power sows the seeds of anger, breeds bitter contempt, and drives deadly wedges of division in our nation and in our communities. Conversely, throughout history, simple ideas have demonstrated immense power to lift millions out of poverty, spark technological innovation, unite former enemies, and strengthen our societies. I've been rethinking just such a powerful idea. The specific idea that politics has the power to reconcile. Politics has the power to heal, unite, and bring about an at-one moment for humanity. Now, that may seem contradictory and possibly downright crazy in the idea of political power in the political world in which we seem to be stuck. Winning over political opponents rather than winning with them is the norm today. The politics of personal destruction, where rivals are demonized and their words are weaponized, is all too common in the world today. How could anyone believe in the power of the idea that politics could actually serve as a way to reconcile the nation? Well, Judge Thomas Griffith, who has appeared with us here on Sunday Edition, is a retired justice of the United States Courts of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Judge Griffith has been a great blessing to my thinking and writing in many, many ways. In the midst of the current political malaise, Judge Griffith and I were emailing not too long ago. And in that email exchange, he shared with me that he has in his office a framed copy of a brochure from Robert F. Kennedy's 1968 campaign that features a statement from that announcement of his candidacy. So in his announcement, Kennedy declared, "I run for the presidency because I want the United States to stand for the reconciliation of men." Having the leader of the United States and the free world stand for the reconciliation of men encapsulates the power of a most extraordinary idea, in my view. Imagine a leader who was not concerned with the idea of his or her own power, but was focused on the powerful idea of reconciliation for all women and for all men. Judge Griffith went on to explain that in his translation of the New Testament, William Tyndale used the word reconciliation to translate the Greek word katallagi, which means a change from enmity to friendship, or the means through which harmony is restored. But sometimes he used a newly created word to express that concept, atonement, or at-one-ment. For people of faith, at-one-ment, or atonement, is a powerful idea about reconciliation with the divine. For Christians, the principal and most eternally powerful idea is that through the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ, that mankind can be redeemed from their sins and be reconciled to God. Now, politics as an act of at-one-ment, that seems strange, but it actually can happen when leaders lead with the power of ideas rather than the idea of their own political power. Let me explain. Applying the deeply spiritual to the incredibly secular, it's also important, as Judge Griffith pointed out, that we humans are likewise to be reconciled with what Chesterton called splendid strangers with whom we share this planet. So when we are reconciled to and are connected with splendid strangers and fellow travelers, extraordinary things happen in society and all around the planet. Abraham Lincoln understood the perils of the idea of power and fully believed in and emphatically embraced the power of the idea of reconciliation. A fractured nation teeming with contempt and driven by division was floundering in the squalor of scarcity thinking and zero-sum power politics. Lincoln knew that if the nation was to survive, its citizens from the North and the South had to be at one, united. Lincoln declared, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passions may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." That seems both a human and divine invitation to reconciliation from Abraham Lincoln. The idea of power can be incredibly corrosive and corruptive. The pursuit of power tends to tear people apart while creating fractious kingdoms filled with echo chambers, group thinking, and contemptuous cronies. Such power has become the hallmark of politicians and political parties, along with their internet trolls, apologists, and loyalists who are on the payroll. The idea of power is what prevents politicians who actually agree on 84% of the policies needed to solve America's big problems like illegal immigration and border security from reconciling around a solution to meet the needs of the nation. It's the idea of power that perpetuates old battles over health care, education, caring for the poor, and many other things. If our political class were to relinquish the power necessary for never-ending fundraising for re-election campaigns, re-election could actually occur, that reconciliation. And more importantly, problems could be solved through the power of ideas. The power of ideas brought forth this nation. Powerful ideas have saved it time and time and time again. Inspired ideas have reconciled the nation, its people, and its founding principles in times of sunshine as well as shadow and great struggle in our country. So imagine if the power of American politics were deployed to create reconciliation. The power of that idea would change the idea of power forever. The politics of reconciliation would help America establish a more perfect union, promote better politicians, and foster the finest people. Reconciled citizens would soon swell the chorus of the Union, and the Republic would be one nation, truly at one, and inspiringly indivisible. Such is the power of an idea. That idea is worth pursuing, worth reflecting, and worth making a reality. Well, that wraps it up for us on Sunday Edition today. Thanks so much for joining us. I am Boyd Matheson. And as always, as you go out into the world today, make sure you see something that inspires, say something that uplifts, and do something that makes a difference. Music and the spoken word is next.